and cyber resilience. We do this panel once a month, the first Thursday of every month. And our focus is really on SMB and the mid-market. So not that we don't have interesting information for the global Fortune 500, but our key target is from Herzog's Bar and Grill up to companies in the $4 to $5 billion range. You have some special needs. You may or may not have the in-house IT staff. You may not have the level of expertise. You may have more generalists than, of course, the global Fortune 500. So again, we want to thank you very much for joining us today. Attendees will receive a nice Yeti mug, compliments of IBM. So again, we'd like to thank you for joining. So I'm going to introduce our panel first. Obviously, I've already introduced myself. Joining me is Eric Stenke from Cirrus. He is a storage and converged architect and solutions specialist. Also joining us today is Steve Kinniston. Steve works for me as our Global Spectrum Storage Business Development Exec. He also happens to be a many times storage industry analyst focusing on the enterprise modern data protection space, data security, and data resilience issues as a storage industry analyst. And also joining me is Ted Latovsky of Evolving Solutions. He's a senior storage solutions architect. Team, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Thanks, Eric.
Good to be here.
Well, as you all know, data resilience, cybersecurity, and data resiliency are the hot topics of the day. You can't look at an IT publication, whether it be online, in the press, and even the general press, about the attack on Continental Pipeline, the shutdown of the Irish healthcare system for over a week, and of course, the large ransom paid by JBS, the largest meat packing company in the world based in Sydney, Australia, over $11 million. In fact, the University of Illinois actually tracks this. It's available online. And while not confirmed, they also mentioned a cyber ransom attack that hit Kia Motors of Korea, and payout was $70 million. So whether you're big, medium, or small, what malware or ransomware can do to you, and even industrial espionage, one of your own IT people stealing things from you, can be pretty damaging your reputation, damaging your ability to take care of your customers, and of course, your support and service of those customers, whether you be in retail, in manufacturing, in the services industry. Your lifeblood is your system. And of course, the most important thing besides your employees is the data about your customers, your prospects, your suppliers, your vendors, and all the things you need to know to run your business. And in fact, it's so top of mind that it's hit the front base of the CEO. 2 recent surveys were done, one by Fortune magazine of the Fortune 500 CEOs. And in that survey, which was released at the very end of May, the number one threat to the business from a Fortune 500 CEO. Now remember, those CEOs have a full army of IT experts as well as their valued business partners like Evolving and Cirrus to help them. Yet even with that, the CEOs at the Fortune 500 level, 66% name cybersecurity as the biggest risk to their business. Not the pandemic, not the recession, not the lack of trained workers, but cybersecurity. Now, KPMG, who you all know is one of the biggest accounting firms in the world and also a solutions integrator, they did a survey of mid-market companies. Okay, the key audience we're addressing here today with this session. And in that survey of mid-market CEOs, you guessed it, the number one threat to the business, according to mid-market CEOs, was cybersecurity. So it's top of mind, and it's something you really need to take seriously. And in fact, at IBM Storage, we would argue that if you don't look at data resilience as part of your storage infrastructure, you'll never have a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy. So with that, I'm going to do the first question. So Steve, as someone who's been doing this for years, and not only as part of IBM and the vendor community, but as a very esteemed storage industry and security analyst, what are sort of the 6 core competencies you could think of that you need for a data resilient framework? What do you need to do with the infrastructure? What are the 6 core things that companies need to do to make sure that their data is resilient and they feel secure with that data?
Eric, thank you very much for asking this. I really appreciate this, because one of the things that we try to think of as IBM is to how to think about a solution from an end-to-end perspective, not just one piece of the infrastructure. And so we've worked really hard to think about, as you think about resiliency for all of your data, for anything that can possibly happen, what are the core things I want to make sure that I have in my environment? Number one, you want to make sure that the administrative privileges for personnel to be able to log in and use the applications, as well as the applications themselves, are secure. So you want to think about that administrative level security. You want to think about what tools and capabilities do you have in your environment that you can take advantage of to identify and monitor things happening in your environment for malicious activity. You want to make sure, and it's simple, encryption pervasively across your environment. The tools and technologies today all have it. You really need to try to use it. You want to think about what different levels, and I don't want to say backup, but what levels of recovery solutions do you have in your infrastructure to help you meet your service level objectives? What are you doing to take advantage of air gapping, whether it be physical or logical, to make sure you've got that protected information? And then finally, we always say a DR plan, and in my opinion, a cyber attack is a disaster, isn't a plan if you don't practice that plan. And the best way to practice any plan is to utilize or take advantage of any capabilities around automation and orchestration. The reality is, if you can automate it, you can practice it more often. When everything goes haywire and your hair's on fire, recovering with automation tools is going to help you build in repeatability, consistency, to be able to get your data back to meet those service levels. So across the gamut, that's how we look at, availability and the tools you should be thinking about for your infrastructure.
Great, Steve. Thank you. Eric, obviously you're out there in the field architecting solutions. How are you helping customers implement some of these 6 core competencies at the actual field level with your customers of Sirius? Eric?
Thanks, Eric. So there's a number of ways that we go about this. One thing that a lot of clients may see or hear a lot about is the 3-2-1 strategy. Having 3 copies of my data in 2 different places, and one of them, preferably is offline most of the time, or offline all the time, depending on how you're doing it. So we look at a variety of mechanisms there, from not only replicating data, but making sure we've got immutable copies of the data. That means data that can't be changed, can only be read, and that we've got that stored in a place outside of the perimeter of our network, at least the majority of the time. And customers sometimes laugh at me when I talk about tape, but I think tape still has a place, because it's really the ultimate in a physical, offsite, a physical vault, if you will. But there's a lot of different ways to do that too, if you don't want to use tape, or you want to have some faster restores. So it's kind of a multi-pronged approach, but we typically start with just having a conversation and doing an assessment.
Okay, excellent. Now, Ted, when you think about it, every customer needs to be on this data resilience and data protection journey as part of their cybersecurity strategy. So what are some of the key things as you're helping a customer put together a strategy? What are the key things that you talk to them about from the aspect of how they can incorporate this into their storage infrastructure?
So the very first thing that we end up having this conversation about is that all the technology in the world, all the infrastructure in the world by itself doesn't solve the problem. That processes, documentation, changes in culture are very, very important in order to get everybody on board and cooperating together. Once we start talking to them about what culture really looks like and what kind of behaviors you want to see, then as that conversation progresses, we can start talking about why we're protecting data, which by and large is generally because we're looking at business outcomes. So once we realize that the business has a vested interest in what we're doing in resilience and data protection, now it becomes a lot easier to have a conversation about where we want the data, how quickly we want to get it back, or how quickly we want to stay available. And those start to lead to more natural conversations about how to solve problems. As an example, if I want to talk about immediate restores, I might want to talk about snapshotting behaviors. But if I want to talk about higher availability or disaster recovery, now I'm starting to have more of a conversation about replication. And if I'm concerned about malware or ransomware, then I need to start having conversations about different levels of data security, whether that's on-prem, off-prem, whether that's a safeguarded copy or object-related storage. And then those conversations build a story for what infrastructure we should acquire and how we should use it.
Great. Thank you, Ted. Now, Steve, Ted just mentioned safeguarded copy. For the audience, could you give them a quick description of what safeguarded copy is and what it does across IBM's both mainframe storage and, most importantly, for this audience, our flash system technology? Give it just a quick overview of what that is, since Ted brought it up.
Sure thing, Eric. As most we released a solution or a capability inside of our flash systems portfolio, as well as our DS8000. The DS8000 was about a year ago. What safeguarded copy is the ability to take a snapshot inside the device, right? The solution, take that snapshot, and that snapshot becomes immutable such that it can't be tampered with. And the nice thing about it is then there are also, based on the administrative privileges, who can actually touch that. So you can actually, in that first segment that I talked about in the last answer about the administrative privileges, make sure that you only have kind of one person focused on being able to touch that information. Then what happens is the system doesn't allow you to take that snapshot and just put it back into production, because the theory being we want to try to protect you against both yourself and kind of any corruption. So you recover that data set to an isolated environment, take a look at it, make sure it's clean and exactly what you need in order to put back into production as a production copy of your data. And once you've validated that, then you can push that into production. Last week, we made an announcement, or 2 weeks ago, we made an announcement about this capability now being available across the entire flash systems portfolio. And quite frankly, a lot of customers really appreciate this because they're capturing that right front. They're not waiting until the 287 days that it might take to go find something. They've got that copy right there and ready to kind of recover from.
Okay, excellent. So, Ted, when people, as you are walking through how they should configure and what they should do, how do they know how to figure out what's the right budget for this, and what are some of the budgetary concerns they need to think about for a data resilient aspect to a corporate cybersecurity strategy?
So to me, that's a forked question. It goes down two different paths, and you can't just go down one. You have to go down both paths. The first part of that discussion is pretty typical, where we're attempting to size the amount of data, what the infrastructure to handle that data is, rate of change, how many copies of data, all of those questions that we're all used to. But the other conversation that has to happen in parallel talks about what the value of the data itself is. What does that mean to the business, the lifeblood of your business? And do you know what an outage would do? Do you know what the cost of a minute of downtime, of an hour of downtime, of a day of downtime is? And those conversations together help the customer understand not just what the infrastructure would have to be to sort of be the bare bottom of what capacity is necessary. They also help define what the budget is to protect the level of importance of their data and their business.
So in that case, they would actually go through the various data sets and figure, for example, what would need a safeguarded copy and what could, you could just go out to tape, and if it's a slow recovery from tape, which it is, that would be fine for that data set. So is that kind of the prioritization you ask them to do? They sort of go server by server or kind of application by application? What do you recommend?
I would argue that conversation is more, even one level removed from application. Talking to people about applications and software very often leads down a rat hole. We think that a conversation about business outcomes, about workflows, right? So as an example, in a retail environment, we regularly have customers that accept that their point of sales, their registers might have data sets that they can capture for 8 or 10 hours. If the backend storage is unavailable for a couple of hours, that's not the end of the world. Business keeps going. But on the other side, in say medical environments where we have customers, an inability to access that data immediately has real world instant impact. So now the availability requirements of that data are going to be much higher. And so it isn't server by server, and it isn't just application by application. I believe that that the conversation has to be about what the workflow looks like in real time, and that helps define the value of their data.
Excellent, excellent. So now, Eric, as you are out architecting systems for the customers, what are sort of 4 or 5 best practices and techniques you have for data resilience as it ties into a corporate cybersecurity strategy?
So as far as best practices, we're talking about things like snapshots. We're talking about things like replicating data. And where we replicate that to could be, on-prem, it could be in the cloud. We could be talking about air gap techniques. We could be talking about cloud object storage and another place to put that data. One of the really nice things about object storage is it's often used, APIs are often used to write to that, and that can really lower the attack vector, or the amount of points of attack. If you're just doing secure API calls over 443, that's a lot less area to protect than traditional. So yeah, we talk a lot about replication, immutable copies of data, and where we store that and what kind of medium we store that on. Detection is another big thing, and I think that's in some ways just as hard as the recovery. And that a lot of this stuff has become so sophisticated. Being able to detect when and if ransomware might be in the environment is just as vital. So looking at things like, or investing in tools to help you discover that. Like, I know IBM QRadar will integrate directly with Safeguard Copy. You can actually start proactively creating safeguard copies if it starts to detect a threat.
Mr. Herzog, if I could,
Yes.
Could I make a comment about that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so Eric, good advice. And I think, Eric, both yourself and Ted have kind of talked about these, but I did want to mention that, I work heavily with our support team, and our support team I've been going back and forth with them over the course of the last 2 years, and they are telling me for the last 2 years, they are getting what we call a cyber incident response per week. So for the last 24 months, someone is calling in and saying, hey, I've had some sort of infiltration or something and I need some help. How can I get back? And in working with that team, that they have actually told me that they have put together kind of a list of best practices for folks to adhere to. And what they tell me is folks that adhere to a lot of these kind of strategies actually can get their back within a day, a couple days, within the week. Folks that don't, we are working with customers for 2 and 3 months to try to help them. And those kind of fall into the category of folks who classify their data, understand kind of better, best, and good recovery of what they need for their information. Folks who protect their Active Directory and LDAP server in a separate location to be able to get that data back in the right place. Folks that take advantage of some form of immutability or air gapping, whether it be logical or physical. Folks that take advantage of the recovering first to an isolated environment and not stepping on production. Folks that practice the 3-2-1-1 methodology of protection, so 3 copies of your data, 2 media types, 1 online, 1 off-site, and 1 offline. And then again, practicing, right? If you can practice that recovery strategy, the more likely you're going to be able to recover in a faster scenario when you get done. So that's just best practices passed on from hundreds of phone calls into support, trying to help our customer base.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve, for that comment. Well, and I was going to come back to you for another question. So I've heard about the free cyber resiliency assessment that IBM Storage offers to both our valued partners, such as Serious and Evolving, but also to end users. Can you talk about what that does? How does the assessment help? What does it do for the end user, and how does it show them what gaps they may or may not have? Can you kind of walk through what that cyber resilience assessment does?
Yeah, great question, Eric. So we call it the Cyber Resilience Assessment Tool, or the CRAT tool. So if you're out there listening and you want to take part in this, just talk to your partners or yourselves about the CRAT tool. And essentially what it is, it's free to customers, so anyone can take it. It's vendor agnostic. We don't care what you're running within the infrastructure. It doesn't matter what storage. It's 100 questions. It takes about an hour and a half to 2 hours to kind of go through with your rep, and it's not tricky at all, right? We don't ask you how much capacity, how many VMs, what applications. We basically ask you, are you backing up? How, what are you? Do you have XYZ backup policies? Are you air gapping? Are you moving to tape? And what you do is you answer. It's simple: yes, no, or maybe, or I don't know, right? And based on this, you get a score for each category. And what we'll do is that we'll put together a spider chart for you to tell you kind of where you're strong and where you have gaps in your environment. And based on those gaps, what we'll do is we'll recommend a workflow or a set of best practices to be able to or a roadmap, I should say, that will allow you to kind of fill those gaps in a strategic way. And I think a big part of it comes to, if you've classified your information, how do you fill those gaps based on the data classes? Because we all know we can't spend an unlimited budget on protecting everything 100% the same way. So how do I align this to my most strategic data, and then how do I put those into place to be able to protect my information? Again, free to customers, work with your partner, take the CRAT, and then use that as a tool to be able to understand how you might approach spending money in your environment to kind of fill those gaps within your environment.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve. So I've got another question for Eric. We've talked a lot about in the early parts of this discussion about architecting, solutioning, identifying, issues that can be fixed. But as we all know, it's not a question of if you'll be attacked, it's when. Honestly, it's, even for small companies, probably going to be how many times a month or how many times a week. So Eric, if I get an attack, what are the things you tell people to do right at the point? They call you and say, Eric, we've had an attack. We need your help. What are the things you tell them to do in the short term to help them get back to a good solution with good data that they can run their business with?
That's a good question. I think it probably is going to depend on a few different factors, but first and foremost, we'd start talking about, do you have copies of the data? Do you have snapshots? When's the last known good? And starting to take a look at that. I think the bigger thing there is planning for it. Just like for 20, 30 years now, we've been planning for various disaster recovery exercises. And someone mentioned earlier, I think it may have been Ted, that this is just part of that. And I think you have to have a focused plan on exactly how you're going to do it so that you don't make poor decisions perhaps when under pressure and do things that end up going to make the problem worse. So just as much as a disaster recovery plan needs to be tested, your cyber resiliency plan needs to be tested, and you need to know who's going to do what, pretty much step by step in terms of mitigating and then recovering from that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eric. So Ted, Eric opened up the door. Now there's been an attack. So how do you see from a data resilience perspective, how can automation help the end users? What can they do to automate some of this recovery and analysis that both Eric and Steve have hinted to? What do you tell them to do from an automation perspective to get them back up and going as fast as possible and as successfully as possible?
So let's take a half a step backwards, and let's presume that if we're having those conversations with the customer, then we're helping them build an automation and orchestration policy ahead of time, that there's a plan. And as Eric already said, we want that plan documented. We want people to be able to do those things and do them in a repeatable fashion, knowing that during some kind of attack or some kind of failure, they're going to be under a lot of stress and they might not be thinking terribly clearly. So if we have this plan documented, then we recognize that we're going to create iterative practices where we keep testing how we snapshot, how we replicate. We're going to keep improving how we do reporting. How do we know that we're under attack in the first place? Did we see data suddenly become unavailable? Did we see a dramatic rate of change in thinly provisioned volumes? Did we see our backup software change what it was doing? So we're looking for all of this information and input, and we're going to look at that all the time. That's going to be part of that new culture, right? But when that happens, the work that you do up front solves or helps solve the problem, because if we are doing repeated snapshots, perhaps we have a snapshot we can roll back to very, very quickly. If we are doing air gap storage, we know that we will have a version of the data that hasn't been accessible or hasn't been deletable by a bad agent. And if we are doing those things proactively in an automated fashion so everybody says backup is easy, restore is a little more challenging. Well, if we've automated that process, then not only are we going to automate the backup, but we're going to automate the restorals, because back to Eric's point, we want to help our customers test those. So while a compromise is going to be stressful, if we're regularly testing both our backups and our restoral methodologies, then hopefully executing on that in a real world scenario just becomes an example of something we've already done. On top of that, IBM has some really interesting features in their snapshotting that actually makes it possible for us to hang on to the corrupted data. Now, a lot of people are going to ask, well, why would I care? It's bad data. Well, depending on what happened, I might want to be able to do forensic analysis. I want to find out who did it, how it was done, and why, so that I can improve my defense against that. And that means that not only do I want to be able to recover as quickly as I can, but if possible, I want to be able to capture what happened to me as a business as well, so that I can then use a lot of industry detection and best practices to figure out how, so I can stop it from ever happening again.
Great. Well, thank you, Ted. So, Steve, everybody has mentioned the word air gapping. And I just realized our audience certainly knows what a replica is. It's a duplicate copy. But I don't know if everyone really realizes what is an air gap. So you could kind of talk about an air gap, what it is, how it works, what it does, so that people understand that terminology, because we've all used it throughout this conversation, but I think it's one that is not the same as, certainly not a normal storage term would be. So could you walk through air gapping, what it is and how it helps?
Sure, great question, Eric. In fact, I was doing a presentation earlier today when the customer was saying, it's kind of the latest buzzword in this kind of data environment that we're in today with regard to resiliency and cyber threats, et cetera. So there are different forms of air gapping, right? There are essentially two forms. There's a logical air gap, which in most people's mind is the ability to provide a tamper-resistant environment for your data to live, right? So it's physically can't be altered by someone. That's kind of what a logical air gap is. And then there's the physical air gap. And by true definition, how the analyst would talk to customers about this is the exactly what it means, right? There's a gap of air between the data and a system. And you can only really achieve that with tape or some form of removable media. And in 99% of the cases for most IT shops today, that's tape. The challenge is tape takes the longest to recover from. However, also, if we know that an infiltration can live inside of an environment for over 200 days, that might be the only clean copy of data that you have, right? If you need to meet your recovery time objectives, the first place you're going to go to is some disk-based form of a repository that's immutable to try to get that information back. And that can range anywhere from what I call kind of the least immutable form of or the least secure form of air gapping, which would be cloud. Just get it off your local network, right? So if I'm snooping around, I can't find it. Maybe it's not the most secure, but at least it's not on-prem. You move to object storage. Object storage can't be tampered with, but it can be deleted. Take that to the next level. I want worm capability on top of my object storage, right? So I want to lock that down. So now I can't delete it or tamper with it. All the way through to some things that we do right on the volume with things with safeguarded copy by making that immutable volume copy, right? And then you move over to tape. So again, it's a way to kind of make that data tamper-proof from infiltration.
So quick comment and then a follow-up question. It sounds like the way you described it, there's sort of three types of air gapping. There's logical but local. You guys, both you and Ted, brought up the rapid recovery from safeguarded copy. So that sounds like it's logical, but it's right there. Then you talked about, both you and Eric and Ted, about going out to the cloud. So that sounds like, while it's still logical, it's remote. As you said, it's offsite, but it's still logically connected. And then you mentioned tape. So it sounds like there's sort of two types of logical, one of which is literally right on-prem, another which is offsite, and then the tape. Is there any way that you could combine them? For example, would I want to do a safeguarded copy and then go out to tape or go out to cloud? Are there any reasons or advantages of having both of them or two of them working together? How would that work if I'm going to do that from air gap perspective?
Yeah, I think, Eric, as all vendors, not just IBM, all vendors, we're in a tricky situation, right? We're in a situation whereby, customers need information and customers have X size budget, right? So how do you enable your customers to understand the different types of capabilities, and then based on their budgets, kind of architect the solution that best fits for them? So that's the first comment. The second comment is you always want to be able to have the belts and suspenders within your environment, right? So I like what you're talking about. You're talking about how do you make that local copy, possibly with your safeguarded copy, snap copy, and then then there's that off-device copy that you want, right? Because an event, whether it be a cyber event or any type of data destructive event, might take out the device in and of itself. So that local copy on the device isn't really helpful. So you want to be able to go to that second copy. What happens if that second copy is on-prem and they wipe out the whole data set? Maybe it's a natural disaster. Then you want to make sure you have it either in the cloud or replicated to a remote environment. And so basically, and again, data classification becomes very important here. You want to take your most important, most critical business operational data, make sure you've got that 3-2-1, right? 3 copies of your data in the right places to make sure you can meet the SLAs for that core data that's going to run your business, and then kind of follow suit after that. So when you look at spending budgetary money, what are you doing to make sure that you can keep the wheels on the car during the race, right? So that you can always keep running. But all of these solutions, we're here to kind of educate on what all of them are. You can feel free to mix and match and build based on whatever your architecture needs or desires are. And I'd be good to hear from others, if they kind of agree with that or if they have other strategies.
Okay.
So this
great.
is Ted. If I can, I'd like to chime in here, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
So bravo, Eric. I definitely agree with what's being talked about. I think that it's important to recognize that cyber resiliency is like disaster recovery, but not necessarily the same. One of the conversations that we regularly have with our customers is that if I am doing, say, synchronous replication, where I'm replicating everything in real time to 2 sites, that's great if I'm worried about hardware failing. But if I end up with bad data at point A or compromised data at point B, then I'm also replicating compromised data to the second site. So if I'm trying to solve more than one problem, which in today's business is always the case, then one of the appeals of the IBM solutions is that I can combine them. So if I'm doing snapshots, I now have an iterative process, a point in time that I knew that the data was at. And with safeguarded copy, I now have the ability to lock those down to make it so that even somebody who had somehow penetrated my environment well enough is going to have difficulty deleting that snapshot. It's not readily available to anybody, and that's the appeal. On top of that, if we're talking about something like tape, LTO 8 is amazing It's capable of about 360 or so, 350, 360 megs a second native, and twice that compressed with huge capacities on tape. The problem is it's difficult to get 1 or 2 files out of it. We see customers still wanting to use tape to take things and put them in what we think of as cold storage or colder storage. They're backing up large data sets on tape, and then they're literally going to eject them from the library and put them somewhere, and that meets that air gap standard. However, restoring from that is generally only going to happen if I need to restore all of it, if I need to restore that large data set. That's why there's this appeal for object. So we haven't really drilled into it, but one of the nice things about object is that the protocol itself doesn't allow you to edit an object. Objects are immutable by design. So when we protect data and push it into an object repository, whether that's an on-prem object repository with IBM Cloud Object or some public cloud offering or hybrid cloud offering, we know that that data is not changeable. It is immutable by design, and it can be readily accessed at a more granular level than I might want to access tape. So I end up with this spectrum of solutions where I start with replication and snapshots and immutable snapshots. And then as I move further away from the real time, I now also have object on-prem, object off-prem, and then all the way out to tape and tape off-prem.
Okay, well, it sounds like, and both you and Eric have now brought it up, that sometimes people think doing something for disaster recovery is data resilience. And while it is a subset, it's very clear that, as you just pointed out, if I do synchronous replication, or since I'm in California where we really do have earthquakes, I'd be doing async to Denver, Colorado, anywhere up and down the coast here, and obviously all around what is known as the Rim of Fire. So Latin America, anything around the Pacific, right? So you can't replicate sync. I mean, if you replicate synchronous, that's nice, but if there's an earthquake, you're toast. So, but people need to realize that replication for that purpose, to recover from an earthquake or a tornado or a hurricane in other parts of the United States, that's not the same as data resilience from an IT espionage incident or malware or ransomware. Some of the customers actually do think it's the same thing, and there's an education process that it's really not, based on what you were telling me, Ted.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, as we come to the end, what I'd like to do is start with Eric first and give everyone the opportunity to talk about just a real world case where you guys have helped someone recover. What were the things you did to help them recover, and what were the things they did from a data resilience perspective? So Eric, just run real world example of someone, whether it be malware, ransomware, or an IT theft, how you guys at Sirius help them recover and get back to a data resilient state.
Sure. So I'm actually following up with this client after this call. So this is well timed. They're fairly large. They use a lot of mainframe and mainframe attached storage. And what we've put in for them, we're actually talking to them about safeguarded copy this afternoon. As Steve mentioned, it's been around on the DS8 for a while, but I think fairly recently announced for Flash system. And then in conjunction with that, we do replication, and then we also do virtual tape as well. And then it's stored in up to 3 different sites. So that's how. So it's not an example, I guess, per se of recovering, but that we're planning to and how we would recover in the event that, like you mentioned before, I think it was you, Eric, that said it's not a matter of if now, it's when. So that's what we're preparing for with that customer.
Okay. Ted, an example either of one you've architected like Eric talked about, or one where you've actually had to help them recover from some sort of attack or IT malfeasance. What example do you have, Ted?
So I'm not at liberty to discuss the customer, but I did have a customer that actually had an actual ransomware attack. And that ransomware attack began to lock out their data set. So the very first thing we had to do in order to help them recover was, believe it or not, they had to stop some of their business processes in order to tighten their security, because much like cleaning a house, It starts with having a clean spot anywhere. I have to have a known good place that I can work to. I need some infrastructure, including network and compute, that I have confidence in. And then I need to start looking at my storage and my data protection in order to get to what I am comfortable with as a known good copy. In this customer's case, it actually involved performing more than one restoral and testing that data in order for them to be confident that this restoral, this snap and this restoral were before they were compromised. And then once that happened, working them through what we would think of as the logical business process of recovery, making sure, as an example, that Active Directory and DNS and all those things come up so that when people are starting to use rule-based access in order to get into systems, that the security for those is already enabled and has also been validated. And that then, once we got to that point, it then became a process that they more understood, where I can simply make sure that I have available storage and compute and then start restoring that data. I would say one of the more important lessons, though, is that that process, even in the middle of doing it, was an iterative, repeating process in order to learn and improve what they were doing. And that now their posture is far more assertive. They're willing to take the extra time to build in the automation and orchestration to shorten those behaviors in the future.
Well, that sounds like in the case of that customer, they learned the lesson that all three of you brought up. A, you got to automate, and B, you better practice. Because I think Eric said it, you don't want to lose your head right at the point of attack. And it sounds like at the point of attack, they hadn't really thought about it. Again, and as one of you also brought up, just the way you practice disaster recovery, if there really is an earthquake, hurricane, flood, or fire, that if you don't practice this, it takes a while. Great. Well, thank you, Ted. So, Steve, obviously, both as a vendor working at IBM, but also in your experience as a data and security analyst, can you describe sort of one instance where you helped someone get back and get this data resilience that they needed?
Yeah, I think it'd be a little difficult to say it was me, but working hand in hand with the support organization, we have worked tirelessly with different organizations to find out exactly, going through log files, identifying what the breach was, identifying where some of the breakdowns were, trying to fill those gaps in the process, and then at the same time helping clients recover data to isolated environments, scanning through, checking that data, making sure it's correct, and then helping them get that data back into production. And what do they need to be able to do that? And so those, we've probably done that a handful of times and working with customers. And I think the biggest thing, and I think we've mentioned it, right? When the event happens and everything's going haywire, keeping calm, cool, and collective, right, to try to get this to happen correctly is going to be your best path to making sure you can be successful. Because if you start going all chaotic and forget everything that right, that's when things start to break down.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve. I'd like to thank the audience, Eric, Ted, and Steve, for all the knowledge you've imparted to us today. I would remind really the audience that this is a serious thing. The reason that mid-tier CEOs, and I don't mean the IT team now, the CEOs of mid-tier companies and the CEOs of the Fortune 500 both rank cybersecurity as the #1 risk is because it's a risk. And in fact, IBM recently did a survey with an analyst firm, and the average cost of a breach now is approaching $4.2 million. So obviously, if you're a really small company, that could be a really hefty bill. And obviously, even if you're a larger company, you don't want to pay that. And clearly the ransomware, if you really get stuck paying it, can be enormous. And, documented for sure has been in that $20 million range. And of course, as I mentioned, the University of Illinois appears to be tracking one that happened in Asia where the ransom was over $70 million. So this is not something to take lightly. Last thing as we close out, want to remind those of you who registered about you'll be getting your IBM mug. And the last thing, please reach out to Evolving, to Sirius, or any of your other IBM business partners and get that cyber resilience assessment taken care of. It's no charge. It's not just about IBM. It looks at your entire storage infrastructure. So any of you that are heterogeneous and have IBM and one of the other vendors, we look really at it from a resilience and a cybersecurity perspective and recommend the right thing. Well, you know what? Those data sets, you might want to air gap those, whether those be logical or physical. Or, wow, you should be encrypting that data. Did you know that IBM Flash system has encryption with no performance penalty in the real world? So real world apps can be encrypted, yet not have the performance that, of course, software teams usually complain about, or the app owners that, whoa, encrypting data slowed it down on my Oracle database or that Mongo or Cassandra. Well, with IBM's Flash system, that's not going to happen. So we look at everything, including your standard enterprise backup feature, which is something like our Spectrum Protect or some other backup product to make sure that can help you. So again, I'd like to thank everyone, particularly the panel, for attending and helping us out a lot. And again, remember, please reach out to your favorite IBM business partner or to your IBMer. The cyber resilience assessment is no charge. It's a freebie and will really help you avoid these in the future. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody and thank you again for attending us. We will be having one again the first Thursday of September, so right after Labor Day. The topic will be all about AI and big data for the mid-sized company. So again, thank you very much, guys. I really do appreciate it, and we'd like to thank the audience for their attendance.
Thanks, Eric.